You think your biggest problem is that you care too much. You think you love too deeply. You think your heart is simply too soft for this world. But that is not the truth. The truth is harder to hear. And once you see it, you may never look at your relationships the same way again. Because what if the reason you stay too long is not love? What if the reason you forgive people over and over is not kindness? What if the reason you keep understanding people who continue to hurt you has nothing to do with being an empath at all? What if you were trained to do it? Think about that for a second. Because there are people walking around right now who believe they are endlessly patient, endlessly understanding, endlessly compassionate. They believe their ability to tolerate pain is proof that they are emotionally strong. They wear that identity like armor. They tell themselves they are different from everyone else because they can see the good in people even when nobody else can. But sometimes what looks like emotional strength is actually emotional survival. Sometimes what feels like love is fear. Sometimes what feels like loyalty is anxiety. And sometimes what feels like empathy is simply a nervous system that learned very early in life that paying attention to other people's emotions was the safest thing to do. Maybe you grew up around unpredictable people. Maybe you learned that peace inside a room could disappear without warning. Maybe you learned to read facial expressions before words were spoken. Maybe you learned to feel tension before conflict arrived. So you adapted, you became observant, you became sensitive, you became someone who could feel a shift in energy before anyone else noticed it. You learned how to detect distance inside someone's voice. You learned how to notice changes in their behavior. You learned how to feel when something was wrong before anyone said a word. And people called this empathy, but nobody asked why you became that way. Nobody asked what created it. Nobody asked what your nervous system had to sacrifice in order to become so skilled at understanding everybody else. Because there is something nobody tells empaths. The person who becomes an expert at reading other people often becomes a stranger to themselves. They become so focused on understanding everyone around them that they slowly stop asking a terrifying question. What do I feel? What do I need? What am I ignoring? Because when your attention constantly lives outside of yourself, something dangerous begins happening silently. You stop learning how to protect yourself. And the worst part is you do not even notice it. Because you think you are loving. You think you are healing. You think you are helping. When in reality, you may be abandoning yourself one small piece at a time. The painful part is that people who stay too long rarely realize they are staying too long. They do not wake up one morning and decide to ignore themselves. They do not consciously choose to sacrifice their peace. It happens slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. It begins with understanding, then it becomes patience, then patience becomes tolerance, and eventually tolerance becomes self-abandonment. This is why empaths often remain inside painful relationships much longer than other people do. Not because they enjoy pain, not because they are weak, but because they see things other people miss. They see potential, they see wounds, they see pain hidden behind anger. They see fear hidden behind distance. They see sadness hidden behind cruelty. And because they can see those things, they begin creating explanations for behavior that should have been questioned instead of justified. Someone becomes emotionally distant and they think maybe they are stressed. Someone becomes cold and they think maybe they are struggling internally. Someone hurts them repeatedly and they think maybe they had a difficult childhood. Someone disappears and returns whenever they want and they think maybe they are afraid of intimacy. At first, this seems compassionate, it seems beautiful, it seems like emotional maturity, but something dangerous starts happening inside this process. Their focus slowly shifts away from one question that should have mattered most. How is this affecting me? Instead of asking whether something is healthy for them, they begin asking whether they can understand it. Instead of asking whether something feels safe, they ask whether they can be more patient. Instead of asking whether their needs are being met, they ask whether the other person is hurting. And over time, they become trapped inside a cycle that feels like love, but actually functions like emotional survival, because survival teaches you to pay attention to everybody except yourself. Think about how many times you ignored a feeling because you did not want to overreact. Think about how many times your body knew something before your mind admitted it. Think about how many times your stomach felt heavy, your chest felt tight, your thoughts felt exhausted, but you stayed because you thought leaving would make you selfish. Because that is the trap. Empaths often believe love means understanding people at their worst, but understanding somebody and sacrificing yourself for somebody are not the same thing. You can understand why someone hurts people and still decide not to stay. You can understand somebody's pain and still decide to protect your own peace. You can care deeply about someone and still walk away. But many empaths never learn that lesson early enough. They learned how to understand others. They learned how to calm others. They learned how to protect others. What they never learned was how to protect themselves. The strange thing is that many people spend their entire lives believing they were simply born more sensitive than everyone else. They believe they naturally care more. They believe they naturally notice more. They believe they naturally feel everything more deeply. And sometimes that is true, but sometimes there is another story happening underneath the surface that nobody talks about. Because what people often call empathy can sometimes be a survival system that developed over years of emotional unpredictability. Imagine growing up in an environment where moods changed without warning. Imagine walking into a room and immediately trying to figure out whether someone was angry, distant, stressed, or disappointed. Imagine learning that emotional safety depended on your ability to recognize subtle changes before they became problems. Over time, your brain would begin adapting to survive that environment. It would become highly alert. It would become highly observant. It would become extremely sensitive to emotional signals around you. This is why some people can instantly notice tension that nobody else sees. They notice pauses in conversations. They notice changes in facial expressions. They notice shifts in energy. They notice when somebody says they are fine while something inside them says otherwise. And many people think this is some kind of emotional superpower. But what they do not realize is that constant emotional scanning comes with a cost, because a mind that is always watching rarely gets to rest. A nervous system that is always scanning for danger eventually stops knowing when danger is actually present and when it is not. This is where things start becoming complicated, because when you become skilled at reading emotional signals, you can begin confusing anxiety with intuition. You begin believing every uncomfortable feeling means something is wrong. You begin trying to predict problems before they happen. You begin preparing for emotional pain before pain even arrives. Suddenly, you are replaying conversations inside your head. You are analyzing messages. You are noticing tiny changes in behavior. You are trying to understand meanings hidden underneath words that other people never even thought about. And the terrifying part is that sometimes you become very good at it. Sometimes your predictions become accurate. Sometimes your observations are correct. And because of that, your brain receives evidence that this constant scanning should continue. It tells you that paying attention keeps you safe. It tells you that watching people protects you. It tells you that understanding everyone around you prevents pain. But slowly something starts disappearing. Presence, peace, rest. Because when your mind constantly lives in observation mode, it becomes difficult to simply exist. You stop experiencing relationships naturally because you are too busy analyzing them. You stop listening to your own emotions because you are too busy managing everyone else's emotions. And eventually you become the person who understands everyone around you while feeling completely misunderstood yourself. Because nobody notices what it costs you to carry all of that weight silently. The hardest truth for many empaths is not that other people hurt them. The hardest truth is realizing they helped create the conditions that allowed it to continue. Not because they wanted pain, not because they deserved it, But because somewhere along the way they confused empathy with self-sacrifice, they confused understanding with responsibility, they confused love with endurance, and that confusion slowly became part of their identity. Because if you spend enough years being praised for being understanding, patient, and emotionally available, you eventually begin believing your value comes from what you can give rather than who you are. You begin believing your worth is connected to how much pain you can carry for other people. You begin believing that if somebody is hurting, it becomes your responsibility to help them heal. And at first, that sounds beautiful. It sounds compassionate, and it sounds like emotional maturity. But beneath that kindness, there is often a quiet fear nobody sees. The fear that if you stop giving, people will leave. The fear that if you create boundaries, people will become disappointed. The fear that if you finally choose yourself, you will become selfish. So instead of protecting yourself, you keep stretching your limits. You keep becoming smaller so other people can remain comfortable. You keep ignoring your own emotional exhaustion because you believe your needs should come second. And little by little, something begins disappearing. You stop asking what you want. You stop asking what feels good. You stop asking what makes you feel safe, because your attention becomes completely attached to another question: what does everyone else need from me? This is where empathy slowly starts transforming into self-abandonment. Not in one dramatic moment, not overnight, but through hundreds of tiny decisions repeated over and over again. Saying yes when you wanted to say no, staying when you wanted to leave, forgiving when something inside you still felt hurt, explaining away behavior that made your body feel unsafe, pretending something did not bother you because you did not want conflict. These moments seem small by themselves, but together they create something dangerous. They teach your mind that your emotions are less important than keeping other people happy. They teach your nervous system that peace only exists when everyone around you is okay. And eventually you reach a point where you can no longer recognize your own emotional reality. You become so focused on understanding everybody else that you forget how to understand yourself. You become so good at carrying others that you forget what it feels like to stand without weight on your shoulders, and then one day you wake up feeling exhausted without knowing why, empty without understanding why, lost without understanding why. Because the person you spent years trying to save was never only them, it was everyone except yourself. There comes a moment that many empaths never expect, a moment that does not arrive with drama, a moment that does not arrive with anger, a moment that does not arrive with screaming, fighting, or emotional explosions. It arrives quietly, almost invisibly. And because it arrives so quietly, most people miss it while it is happening. Because after years of carrying emotional weight, after years of making excuses, after years of understanding everyone else while ignoring themselves, something begins changing deep inside. At first, the empath does not notice it. They still answer messages, they still smile, they still listen, they still give, they still show up. From the outside, everything looks normal. But internally, something has started shifting. The first thing that changes is not behavior, it is energy. They begin feeling tired in places rest cannot fix. They begin feeling exhausted in ways sleep cannot explain. Conversations that once felt natural suddenly feel heavy. Situations they once tolerated suddenly feel draining. People they once chased suddenly feel distant. And this confuses them because they think something is wrong with them. They think maybe they are becoming cold. They think maybe they are becoming selfish. They think maybe they are losing their ability to care. But that is not what is happening at all. What is actually happening is awareness beginning to break through survival. For years, they were operating automatically understanding, automatically forgiving, automatically giving people access to parts of themselves that should have been protected. But eventually the nervous system reaches a limit. Eventually the body becomes tired of carrying emotional weight that was never supposed to belong there. Eventually something inside begins asking questions it avoided for years. Why am I always the one trying harder? Why do I feel lonely around people I care about? Why am I constantly exhausted after giving everything I have? Why do I keep feeling responsible for emotions that do not belong to me? And these questions become dangerous because once they appear, they rarely disappear. Because awareness changes everything. Before awareness, you explain pain. After awareness, you recognize patterns. Before awareness, you blame yourself. After awareness, you start seeing imbalance. Before awareness, you keep trying harder. After awareness, you start wondering whether trying harder is the problem itself. This is the moment many empaths describe as waking up. Not because they suddenly become stronger, not because they suddenly stop caring, but because for the first time in years, their attention slowly begins returning home, back to themselves. What happens next often confuses everyone around them because people become used to a certain version of the empath, the version that always answers, the version that always understands, the version that always gives another chance, the version that always stays. So when that person begins changing, people rarely recognize it immediately because the change is not loud. There are no dramatic speeches. There are no emotional explosions. There is no desperate need to prove anything. Instead, something much quieter begins happening. The empath slowly starts pulling their energy back. They stop explaining themselves as much. They stop chasing conversations that feel one-sided. They stop forcing connections that only survive because they keep carrying them. They stop trying to convince people to care. And for the first time, they begin paying attention to something they ignored for years. Effort. They begin noticing who reaches out first. They begin noticing who only appears when they need something. They begin noticing who listens and who only waits for their turn to speak. They begin noticing who values them and who simply became comfortable receiving from them. And suddenly, relationships that once felt normal start feeling strange because the empath is no longer filling every empty space with their own energy. They are no longer rescuing silence. They are no longer repairing every emotional distance. And that is when many people become confused because people often mistake endless giving for personality when it was actually overfunctioning. They mistake emotional labor for love. They mistake self-sacrifice for loyalty. But now something different is happening. The empath is beginning to understand that relationships were never supposed to feel like carrying another person's emotional world on their back. They begin understanding that connection is supposed to move in both directions. And this creates a strange kind of silence, not the silence of anger, not the silence of punishment, but the silence that appears when someone becomes tired of abandoning themselves. Because there is a difference between silence that wants attention and silence that has reached clarity. One still hopes something changes, the other has already accepted the truth. And once an empath reaches that place, people often think they became cold. People think they suddenly changed. People think they stopped caring. But that is rarely true. The reality is often much simpler and much harder to accept. They did not stop caring about other people. They simply started caring about themselves too. The truth is that this is where the real power of an empath begins. Not at the moment they learn how to feel more, not at the moment they learn how to understand people better, not at the moment they become even more patient or even more giving. Their real power begins the moment they finally understand themselves, because for most of their lives they believed their sensitivity was something that needed to be managed. They believed they were too emotional, too affected, too caring, too invested, too much. But they were never too much. They were simply carrying too much. There is a difference because sensitivity itself was never the problem. The problem was direction. For years, their attention moved outward toward everyone else's pain, toward everyone else's needs, toward everyone else's emotions. And because of that, they kept giving away energy without asking whether it was being respected, valued, or returned. But once awareness enters the picture, everything changes. Because now empathy stops being automatic. It becomes intentional. Instead of feeling responsible for everyone, they begin becoming responsible for themselves. Instead of trying to rescue every person who enters their life, they begin asking whether that person is willing to rescue themselves. Instead of seeing boundaries as rejection, they begin understanding them as protection. And suddenly their sensitivity transforms into something entirely different. It becomes clarity because When you stop chasing approval, you begin seeing people more clearly. When you stop fearing abandonment, you begin noticing who actually belongs in your life. When you stop trying to save everyone around you, you begin recognizing who was only comfortable receiving without giving anything back. This is why healed empaths often appear different to people who knew them before. They laugh differently, they speak differently, they move differently. There is less anxiety inside them, less urgency, less pressure to prove themselves, because they are no longer carrying the emotional responsibility of everyone around them. They are no longer abandoning themselves in order to feel needed. And maybe the most beautiful part of all of this is that they do not lose their empathy. They do not become cold. They do not become distant. They do not become heartless. They simply become selective. They finally understand that protecting their peace is not selfish. Walking away from imbalance is not cruel. Choosing themselves is not betrayal, because the goal was never to stop caring. The goal was to stop disappearing while caring for everyone else. And when that finally happens, empathy stops feeling like a burden and starts becoming what it was always supposed to be, a strength that helps you understand people deeply without losing yourself in the process.